Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this episode of 30 Minutes to President's Club. My name is Armand Farouk, and I'm here with my co-host, Nick Sigelski. And folks, today we have a proof of concept pilot masterclass with the one and only Rehr-Davis. He is the SVP of Sales over at SaaS Labs. Nick, why should people listen?
Most salespeople, when they run proof of concepts, they run them so poorly, their deals go poof and disappear. In this episode, we take you through an extremely structured approach as it relates to when you should be initiating POCs, who to initiate them with, how to set very clear entry criteria, both on problems, power, and the outcomes they're looking to accomplish, as well as how to make sure that you manage that POC so that it doesn't run wild from a scope perspective, and so you actually get your deal closed when you are forecasting it. All right, Darren, welcome to the show. We start every single episode with your top 3 actionable takeaways, so let's get your 3.
My first one is the call prep. Always know what the business does, what the buyer and champion does, where the lead comes from, essentially every detail, because later on in that deal cycle, when you need to get your executive involved, I see a million times that executive is not properly prepared. And so really you're preparing for the next few calls and to drive that deal forward by making sure every single detail, every relationship has been identified, and how to best connect with the individual or what the public reports might say on a business, how they're growing, what their funding is, will help you move forward.
Beautiful. What's number 2?
POC Disco. The POC Disco is essentially a success plan or mutual success plan that allows you to prevent things like scope creep, reduce churn, and increase value. This is best done by identifying the key business outcomes. Example, you're going to increase call rates, reduce time to make calls, increase connectivity rates. You're going to identify the key features. The key features are going to be the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves. What features, if they are missing, would prevent you from purchasing a platform? And then, of course, the key milestones. And I break down the key milestones into who, the users, do they need to have sign-off? Does the admin need a certain scope? When, the duration of the POC, and then some sort of exit criteria. At my time at Looker, we made it mandatory that they had to test writing LookML to see how easy or intuitive the new lines of code would be. And then, of course, you end that with a handshake, some sort of exit action where this bare minimum of success, what that looks like at the end of the call, if we solve the above, then we get to move forward based on this agreement.
Round us out. What's number 3?
Number 3 is the technical sign-off and the business sign-off. You typically can break this down into 2 different personas. As you move into mid-market deals or enterprise, or if you have a very technical solution or very just solution-oriented product that's complex, trying to identify who is going to make the decision from a technical perspective. Oftentimes that might be your super admin or your administrator, someone that will own the project and implementing the project and maintaining it. But also you need to identify who's actually going to sign the check. And if you don't have both of those personas identified, then it can be really difficult where your deal starts to get longer or drag on, or maybe it doesn't close when it should, despite having alignment from a technical perspective. Technical sign-off is the champion who wants your solution, sees value, making sure you're identifying that business sign-off. And it could be multiple people. It could be the person who signs the contract or the signatory versus the person who has the budget, like a CFO or VP of sales, procurement, negotiations, and all those things.
Alrighty, Darren. Where in your sales cycle are you typically initiating a POC?
We are trying to build that success criteria in the middle of our sales cycle after we've gone through qualification and identified ideally that they're a good fit, or as close as possible we can identify. But all of our prospects are sort of hitting a threshold, whether that's at Looker or JustCall or even Google. At some point, they're really going to need some sort of handholding or help to really identify how to receive the most value from your platform. And that's when we're going to jump in and offer a more hands-on approach to ensure that we are reducing any sort of latencies or things that might take time. We can leverage best practices or help move the process and agree to a criteria that helps us get to that business sign-off.
So you have individual users who have gone in through your PLG motion and they're using basically the freemium version of the product. You use the word threshold to determine, hey, we're going to reach out and offer a POC. What are some of those thresholds that you would look for at the different places where you have offered POCs as a way to expand people from free users to fully paid wall to wall?
As you can imagine, most PLG motions, the initial subset of users that are going to come in and use your platform are likely 1 or 2, 3, 4, whatever that number might be.
Mm-hmm.
But as they start to think of whether it's a dollar value in terms of thresholds, maybe $1,000 a month or $12,000 a year, or maybe that number is closer to $30,000 a year, I think that's probably the sweet spot where you start to say, you know what? This might get a little bit more complex, and that's typically because not only is there a dollar value threshold, but you start to think about that complexity being related to likely either needing more portions or features within the platform, or of course, in JustCall's case, more users. Once you start adding all those different users, you need some sort of threshold where you say, you know what? This isn't going to be as intuitive as we'd like for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 people. We need to make sure we're getting the entire team on board and giving them the best experience as possible.
At Pave, I remember there were tons of customers who would ask for a POC, but the number of POCs we would actually take on is pretty small. What are the types of deals that you believe should go through a POC versus the ones that you think you should just try to push through in a normal sales process?
While I was at Looker, our solution was so technical at the time. And for those of you familiar with Looker, there's a code called LookML. It was new, but it was a varying version of SQL. And that in and of itself removed deal value and deal size. Everyone needed a POC because everyone had to learn how to write that code. At JustCall, we've had the opposite problem where our business was built off the back of PLG. And as we've started to move upstream, we've really started to hit thresholds where you say, you know what? Okay, for 50 users, maybe 30K, 40K in deal value, 50K, it's just not as intuitive as it might be for someone going and setting it up for 1 or 2 people. And you're going to hit those roadblocks of, is this the right tool for me because it's ease of use, or it's taking too much time, or I couldn't figure out an integration, or someone on my team needs help. It really depends on the product, but you can attach it. Like at Looker, our smallest deals typically range around 24K. Again, more of a complex, very technical solution, where at JustCall, I would probably anchor that our MVP would be 30K, 40K, 50K or higher.
If you've got a really transactional, self-serve product, super simple, minimal customizations, sure, you can work with it, but the reality is like what you see is what you're getting. However, there's a client that I consult for, their name is Covey, and they have an AI resume screening bot. And it is really hard for them to get someone to pay $50,000 unless we go and have the AI bot screen resumes for one of their jobs, because they see the automated AI screening for a generic job application. But they're like, how do I know that for my engineering criteria, you're actually not going to DQ all of my best candidates? For types of solutions where it's really hard for a prospect to make it real for their own situation, those are the types of solutions where I oftentimes find you need to get your prospect in the car. Versus at Pave, we could literally configure a custom demo that looked exactly like their comp planning workbooks, and there was oftentimes no reason for them to log into Pave themselves. We just needed to prove to them that our software could support their solution.
There's been a term floating around, probably at least I've been more privy to it over the last 5 years, of changing POC to POV, proof of value. And I think that's your exact point, is really making sure that those end users are going to, hey, I'm going to be able to fit this into my existing workflow. I'm going to get the value out of this that I'm expecting, and really giving it a test drive, because otherwise, why not smaller and see if you can expand over time?
So let's talk about that conversation that you have with the buyer before you enter into a POC. My guess is you see, okay, we've got this cluster of users who are getting initial value from our thing, but we think if they implemented this for the entire organization, they'd get a lot more value. They could take advantage of the different integrations that we have, all the premium features, etc. My guess is you reach out to some degree of an executive who oversees the people that are using the product, and you get a meeting with them. Let's skip how you get a meeting with them, and let's talk about what do you actually discuss with them in said meeting before entering into a POC.
The other benefit of the POC is making sure that it's a fit on both sides. And to me, that's never talked about enough in sales, is about disqualifying your prospects, which, by the way, sometimes makes your prospects want your solution even more.
Yeah.
So it's a nice little trick. But when you are getting into the meat of those POC discussions and those pre-planning discussions, it's really a qualification or an agreement on both sides. And that's where that mutual success criteria comes into plan of how am I going to go about ensuring by the time that this call is done that I'm not going to be doing a year-long implementation for a complex client, because that's not the intention. The intention is for them to come in and test exactly what needs to be tested, agreed to on both sides, with both sides understanding that it's a fit, hopefully an ICP fit for your organization. Because if you start looking into some of the bigger, broader metrics, no one wants a customer that's going to early churn a few months down the road or a year later or even a couple of years later. For a lot of us, it takes that long to get our money back.
Armand, one of the things that I've learned from you is before you go into a POC, you are very, very firm on getting exit criteria of what makes the POC a win that would make them say, I am ready to sign a contract if you can hit this exit criteria. As I think about those pre-POC conversations that I have with my customers, the two things that I really want to identify are, one, what is the problem that they are looking to solve? That one's pretty straightforward. But two, what is the outcome that they are looking to accomplish by solving that problem? You can solve that problem and achieve some different outcomes. And if you can't anchor to solve problem and get them where they want to go, you may enter into a POC where you solve the problem, but they're like, yeah, but it didn't achieve this weird quasi-adjacent use case outcome, and you're not going to get the deal, and you wasted all of that time. From a qualification perspective, the customer wants to have that conversation with you about the thing that they want to accomplish, and it also helps de-risk things for you dramatically.
The business outcome piece, and that's the thing you start to think about your technical buyer who's probably evaluating certain workflows, ease of use, saving time. Are they scaling their own bandwidth? But with these certain POCs, you're diving in and trying to really understand, hey, if I solve these, that's great. But what, from a business perspective, am I helping move the needle forward? I always like to say you're either making a business money or you're saving them money. That's the only reason they're purchasing the software.
So when I think about POC exit criteria, I think of two types of exit criteria. The first type is the functionality exit criteria. And that might be like, we can run an end-to-end compensation cycle and your product supports our comp philosophy. That's really just, does the product work for us? And then you have more like outcome-based exit criteria. And this is where these can be really powerful for driving the business case with the CFO, or they can be really, really dangerous. For example, good outcome exit criteria might be, in a week-long POC, if I'm using JustCall's parallel dialer, I can get my SDRs to double their dials per hour. To me, that is very controllable. And then what you can do is you can scale that up to how many more connects they'd get, how many more meetings they would book, how much more pipeline they would generate, and ultimately over 3, 4, 5, 6 months, how many more deals you would close. Dangerous exit criteria would be, in this 2-week POC, I want to see that we've generated $300,000 more in pipeline, when half of those meetings that you've booked have literally not even happened yet. When someone comes to you and they're like, Darren, I need to see that JustCall in this POC is able to drive 20% more pipeline per rep with me, how do you handle that situation?
When you think about the outcomes that you're trying to drive, this is where not only understanding your business, your solution, and your product is important, but also understanding the actual businesses that you're selling to becomes so important. Because if you can dive in and say, in that exact scenario, hey, I know I'm going to be able to do those 3 call blitzes and I'm going to double the amount of calls that you're making, but are you calling the same exact type of prospects, or are you adding new lists to this POC? Because if you can start asking questions like that, then you can start to figure out or try and identify, look, Do you have certain conversion rates? Are those conversion rates going to stay steady? Because as you start to economies of scale when it comes to leads, for example, as you start to scale leads, you might end up getting diminishing returns. And really understanding the businesses, making sure you're doing the right type of research. And if all things are staying the same, and they can double their output across those 3 call blitzes, then it might be a realistic time frame 6 months down the line when everything else is converted throughout your funnel, but it might not be a realistic time frame to do it within 14 days or however long that POC might be.
One of the best things that I've learned to influence exit criteria is to actually share data or like industry benchmarks of this is typically where good looks like for your industry. What you're asking is wholly unrealistic. If we can just get close to good or make progress in that direction, that's a really good way to reset expectations. I want to ask you about the altitude on the power line of the human being that you are talking to when you initiate these POCs. Do you have a certain threshold for where somebody needs to be in the organization for you to say, yep, we're going to do this thing?
Primarily getting to whoever's going to have the technical sign-off would be the top priority, or at least most consistently across the board. However, we've also used POCs to help drive things like executive alignment, where if you're not willing to spend a certain amount of time with me, why am I going to spend a certain amount of time with you? Because giving free resources to do a POC with a solutions engineer and an AE, maybe someone from support eventually has to get involved. You're spinning them up an instance. In JustCall's case, you have to give them calling credits, all these different things. Like, why would we do that if we don't have the right alignment in place beforehand?
If an analyst is pushing you for a POC and you're like, great, let's loop in your VP of sales, and they're like, no, I want to run the POC first, how do you confront that? How do you sell them on the why behind why power needs to be involved?
With JustCall, it's funny because it's easier said than done. But the concept is that's the purpose of if you want to go test it yourself and you're not willing to invest the right resources, that's very doable. If you're considering purchasing this for your entire organization with a larger use case, you should make sure, and this is some of that reverse selling, right? You go make sure that this is worth your time by including the right resources, and we'll reciprocate with doing the right thing. And we've been trying to really push on our sales team to start getting comfortable with just saying no. Yeah. And again, it ends up leading to a lot more yeses. I know that's sometimes like hard to conceptualize, but when you can go down that path and say, hey, we do need some sort of trade-off. I'm not just going to say yes to everyone, or make sure your qualification criteria is just rock solid. And you're only offering your POC criteria to the tippy top of your pipeline anyway. If you can do one of those two things, you're going to set yourself up to be successful.
I remember when I tried to run a POC when I was the director of sales over at Carta. I bypassed my IT and security review, and I just installed that thing for my entire SDR org. And I got lit by legal, by my VP of sales. And guess what? We kept the POC going. But once it got in front of my VP of sales, he was like, we're in a 2-year contract here. We don't have the resources for this. This isn't part of our priorities. It's like, this just wasted a bunch of our team's time and resources. And honestly, I just tell that story to my prospects, which is, I want to be able to solve this problem for you, with your team. The last thing that I want to do is get you and your team all using this thing, all excited about it, only to find out that your boss never wanted you to look at this thing in the first place and then has to let everyone down. I would rather have them be involved up front so that you have some enthusiasm and support coming behind this and understand if this is not going to be a priority at all before we even both spend resources on this. And I find when you frame it in their best interest, they tend to be like, oh, okay, I understand.
That's a really great story, and it sort of reminds me of what you were saying, Darren, about almost using the POC as a way to get power to actually commit to doing this thing. And what you're doing, Armand, is you're saying, hey, I did what you're about to do, and I got in really, really big trouble. And so at the very least, before we do this thing, you've got to go clear this with legal, you've got to go clear this with IT, and you will often find that someone who is just wanting to play around with some new software is not willing to make that time investment to go do those things, and you're not going to even initiate the POC or get the deal with that person, and that is a good thing, because now you can go focus your time on deals that are actually going to close. And Darren, one other thing that I really want to double down on what you said is, It is a good thing to say no to your prospects. I see way too many salespeople who they conflate sales with customer service, and they're really, really afraid to tell a prospect, hey, we're not going to do that. Sorry. They're terrified of it, and you're right. When you actually stand up there, more often than not, if they really want to buy your product and solve the problem that your product solves, they will go find a way to get it done. But too many salespeople, they get themselves in these really hairy, weird situations because they're not afraid to put their foot down.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're trying to identify if they're putting the right resources in place or not, even before you're doing your POC, by who's involved in that deal, you can already see the value to the organization. If they're including a VP or a C-level, they're spending thousands of dollars by being on the call with you. There's value in that. If they're unwilling to do that, there's probably pretty direct correlation between, hey, this might not be a very top priority for the organization where they're willing to spend not only the value that on the time of that call with the different individuals, but what else they could be working on and what else they could be doing. That's something we talked a lot about at Looker, and we've just started talking about at JustCall as, hey, have that confidence where if they're not willing to spend the right amount of money, essentially, just by getting on calls with you, that's already a huge red flag. And it's always correlated, too, in your deals, right? The more executives involved, the more times they're willing to meet with you, the numbers are out there.
I call this the 3 Ps of POC entry criteria. The first P is problem. There needs to be a very clear problem that you and your organization need to solve. The second P is power. Power needs to care and be aware of this POC. And then the third one, which is a little bit more controversial, is price. You need to know how much this thing costs from an investment standpoint before I go put it in the hands of 30 of your reps. If we're a million miles away on a proposal, I'm not saying we have to have a deal signed, but if you're thinking you're going to pay $5K and this is a $75K solution, we shouldn't even go into a POC. So the most common mistakes that I see sellers make with POCs are, number one, they have the wrong entry criteria. In other words, they're violating the 3 Ps. Number two, they don't have clear exit criteria. In other words, they enter POCs that they literally cannot win because someone wants to close more deals inside of the POC. The final area where I see sellers screw up is the scope. Once we actually start this POC, what are the ways that we achieve the exit criteria? A lot of people are like, here's the software, I'll see you in 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, they haven't even set up the integrations, let alone use the thing. So can you talk, Darren, about how you chop a POC into milestones? And maybe you can use JustCall as an example.
If you can identify the certain areas that must be tested or trialed, you can build data sets around that on, hey, if we go and make sure that this amount of usage in these areas exist, this deal is going to close at 50% of the time, 60% of the time. And what we ended up doing is at JustCall is we ended up creating a scoring. And for us, there's actually a pretty heavy lift heading into a POC because you're making calls or sending messages, testing how those calls and messages are received or integrated into existing workflows like Salesforce, your CRM, HubSpot, Pipedrive, ActiveCampaign, a million others. To do that successfully, you're not going to go and call and your number is going to go to spam and automatically talk about bad criteria. You're going to have a 0% connection rate because your number's not registered. So we require some sort of overhead as you're going into the POC. And that way we know that their business is registered. We know that they're willing to share certain levels of information with us. For example, at Looker, we made sure they always connected to a live database, which was a huge point for us in the POC cycle. And then once that happens, it's much easier for us and with JustCall, their numbers are registered. They've already integrated into their CRM or existing workflows. And you can start to parse it out and say, okay, great. You're now able to make these calls. You're now able to send these messages. You can start to track activities and start to track the outcomes in a pretty tight schedule over a 2-week period where you're breaking that into quadrants of maybe 3 or 4 days and then revisiting it once or twice a week.
So what would a 3 or 4 day quadrant look like? What would you ask your prospect to do during those 3 or 4 days?
The first one is the business registration. It sometimes can take longer too, which is an unfortunate thing for us and something that we run into in terms of deals getting dragged out is it's outside of our control, getting some of those numbers registered. But if we can push them through, the next portion of that 3 or 4 days is really trying to ensure that that number is working properly. Sometimes we'll test that number. We'll do a couple test calls. Sometimes for the registration, it will actually take a couple days for it to work. But you want to ensure, yes, if you're going to go through this process, there's no point in testing a number again that's going to go to spam and you're going to get 0 pickups on, right? And for us, that's just a really easy way to go straight to an unsuccessful POC. Now, there's some tricks and tips that we can use specific to our business on how to get around those or speed them up at times for the right use case. But that's during that first 3 or 4 days. Are we integrated with your platform or your CRM, your help desk, your ticketing tool, whatever it might be? And then are your numbers registered and have we tested them? And that way you can go and start actually testing the platform yourself confidently.
Pro tip here, use meetings as milestone deadlines. I will oftentimes set that first integration meeting and say, at this meeting, we will review all of your integrations to make sure that you've set them up the right way. Because if you just say, hey, set it up and let me know, they will never do it. It lags and lags and lags and lags. Or you can literally say, okay, in this first meeting, you need to bring all of your API keys to that meeting. We are going to set it up live. Because people tend to drag their feet on IT stuff and get confused. You want to speed path to integration setup so that they can get in the car as soon as humanly possible. You can use meetings as deadlines or working sessions. Let's say that their business setup is correct. What does the second quadrant look like? Do you actually have them hitting the phone? Are you assigning them dial tasks and dial goals? How do you actually do that?
We'll typically try and get somewhere between 2 to maybe 10 users max onto the platform where we'll assign a number to them and they can go start to test whatever mutual criteria that we've agreed upon prior to the POC and making sure that that criteria is being met, whether that's from a business outcome perspective. And again, you got to make sure you're choosing the right ones, something that can actually control versus things that are outside of our control. We're not going to go, if your deal cycle is 120 days, we're not going to control closing deals in the first 14 days. But if you can control those leading indicators or those outcomes and actually start to put them to test, that's where the meat of the next 3 or 4 days is. I recently have had a huge pet peeve because we've gotten to a couple of POCs where we have not had the right business sign off necessarily at the end. We thought we were talking to the final decision maker or got to some executive beforehand, and then there's other cooks in the kitchen or we didn't know what the process was. The best time to me to really start getting into the meat of that pricing, start to work on legal procurement, depending on the size of the deal, would be right in the middle of that POC with peak excitement. Hey, I'm making calls. This is working. Go talk about the business then when they're seeing a ton of value and they're excited about your solution. And that's when I typically would recommend start to multi-thread, keep them separate, but start to multi-thread and go, hey, our champion is going to go and speak the world of us right now. Let's go start making sure by the end of this POC we can get this deal signed.
Really, really smart. You move to vendor review in the middle of the POC. You don't wait until it's finished. You say, great, this thing's working. There's a ton of excitement. Let's move to contracting. And you parallel process that with the last piece of the POC. That is brilliant. Darren, the clock is ticking. We are running out of time. We have to move to the final question now. And so the final question is this. We've talked about a lot of really good habits and good things salespeople should be doing with POCs. My last question for you is, what is one bad habit that you think a lot of salespeople need to break because it hurts them more than it helps?
I'll use my recent example of this pet peeve I've had where we wait till the POC is over and say, hey, will you start reviewing our contract? And you said so-and-so is going to be the decision maker on this. And all of a sudden, there's 10 more steps. It's where we typically lose deals at JustCall, is if we're not having those conversations. And it's not even because we didn't add value in the POC or we did something wrong. It's literally time kills all deals. Do you want to try and keep your deal cycle to 20 or 30 days in total? Or do you want it to go another 15 days after you finished your 14-day POC and however long it took you to get into that POC? And a million reasons end up coming up, as you could always imagine. And that is my number one pet peeve right now.
Beautiful. Darren, thank you for joining us. Everybody stick around for a 60-second recap coming up soon.
All right, Nick, it's time for a 2x2 recap from this episode with Darren, Rehr-Davis. What do you have for your 2?
Number 1 is when the POC is going well, take that moment of peak excitement and use that as the time to initiate vendor review. You don't have to wait until the POC ends if they're feeling really, really good about things. And then parallel process the vendor review, the legal, the finance elements of what they need to do while you're finishing out the POC. You will make your deal go faster that way. Number 2 is you can use a POC as a way to get to power. So don't just run one with a lowly analyst. If somebody wants a POC and they're an analyst, you can say, yeah, this is something we could do, but we need to get the VP involved. And here's why. Armand, you told that really great Carta story about how you did this as a director and you got in trouble with legal and with IT. And when you share that story and say, hey, I've seen this go wrong before, this is why it's in your best interest to get an executive involved, it gets the customer to understand you're on their side. You're not intentionally withholding things from them.
Number 3. When you are entering a POC, make sure you have achieved the correct entry criteria. The 3 Ps are problem agreement, power alignment, and price understanding. And then lastly, number 4, you need to sign up for exit criteria that you can actually achieve. That means things you can control within the confines of the POC. So those can be output metrics if the output metrics can be achieved in a short period of time, like doubling dial volume in a single dial blitz. And then you can use benchmarks to project. That probably means you will generate more pipeline, but closing 2 times more revenue is not achievable exit criteria within a 2-week time frame. That would take 6 months to achieve. Alrighty, Nick, how can people help us out here?
If you liked this episode and you want to go deeper on how to run POCs that have an extremely high win rate and also don't waste your time, we put together a 30 MPC guide, a step-by-step guide to running POCs. It's on the 30 MPC newsletter. There's a link in the show notes to go check it out. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week on the show.